Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV, and it is the end of my enforced absence. I finished my 6-day World War II TV Normandy tour, and there'll be news about 2 new itineraries next year, a 6-day American tour and a 6-day British-Canadian or Duke tour. Anyway, right now, Lucy Betteridge-Dyson has co-hosted both World War II and World War I TV. She returns today to talk about her awesome new book, Jungle Commandos. There's my copy there. Links to purchase it are in the description below. The assault across the Chinwin and other rivers, hills, and mangroves in Burma is a fascinating international campaign. I'm delighted to welcome Lucy back to chat and answer some of your questions. So I'll bring her in now. Good evening, Lucy. How are you today?
I am good. How are you doing?
Good. It seems like old times again. Good to have you back. It's the months have passed, but so I mean, and it was an early show on World War II TV where you came on and talked about the Commandos back then, and then since then, obviously, lots more research and now a book at the end of it. I think I will bring up some maps things later on, but one of the questions I want to ask you is, it has had this label, Burma, the Forgotten Campaign, but you mentioned in your book, the work of Jack Bowser and Robert Lyman and others, and is it still forgotten, or is it partially forgotten? Where do you think the state of the Burma campaign is now?
Yeah, I tried to like when we were doing, like when I was writing the book and when I was chatting to Osprey about marketing, all those bits and pieces you have to do, I was like, I really want to stay away from the word forgotten. I don't want it in the title. I don't want it in the, in the descriptions. I don't want it in anywhere on the book, because it's something that's really annoyed me because, for the men themselves, my granddad among them, it was them. They were the forgotten, and that was a name that they actually held with pride, and there were reasons why they felt that way when they got back. But now, in terms of public history, there are so many historians doing amazing work on the Burma campaign. Yes, there's huge amounts left to be done, and it's covered, in the media far less than war in Europe and stuff like that. But actually, it does a disservice, I think, to the sort of scholars working on it in academia and people who, like Rob, like Jack, who are writing these amazing books, to call it forgotten. So that's not something I like. But that being said, how many books are there on Burma? Probably, a fraction of, the number of books written on Dunkirk even. It's so in that sense, it's still underrepresented in terms of how important it was, and in terms of certainly the number of people that fought in the Burma campaign. But yeah, it's a bit of a trope, and I do try and stay away from it a bit, and then
I think also, just sorry to interrupt you, is the other thing I think with podcasts and YouTube is that people are connecting the dots more. People are looking at the Burma campaign in conjunction with Southeast Asia and the Pacific campaign and the logistics in more of a global way. Whereas I think perhaps when I was starting, it was like people were a purist Normandy person, or they were an Italy person. I think now we are looking at how it isn't just the Burma campaign in isolation. It's how it does fit in with everything else. And I particularly, and this is what I want to drill down on you, we're recognizing the international aspect of all campaigns, but particularly the Burma campaign, where maybe 50 years ago it was white people writing about white people against the enemy, and now it seems to be seen as a much more, as it really was, international. So that we'll get into some of the maps things in the book, then have a loose chat, and folks, we will answer some of your questions as well. But sources, I mean, your grandfather was there, so obviously you've got that absolute deep connection with an individual, and then you've got that first sort of access to archives in the UK. But there are people fighting in this campaign for whom there are less accounts. So how do you tackle that kind of aspect of it, of being fair to everybody, but understanding that there are certain aspects of it that have more information than others?
Yeah, I mean, before I kind of talk about that a bit, just to briefly sort of finish on what we were talking about with the Burma campaign being covered. I think you're right. I think it's being looked at in the whole, and how it connected to the rest of the war a lot more. And I think, Rob's book, War of Empires, did a lot to kind of bring that more to the public. But also, I think we're looking now at aspects that, for some reason, nobody looks at in Burma, just like the use of armor, combined operations, things that have been written about loads in the war in Europe. But for some reason, people thought that didn't happen in Burma, or it wasn't worth looking at, and so it's a fresh look at things in that sense. And I think I think it's great, and I think, you know, as important as the Chindits and POWs and, you know, the railway is, actually, you know, as you say, there's a whole war out there in the campaign, and understanding why it happened. And so I think, you know, there'll be I know, in fact, in the next couple of years, there's going to be some other great books coming out on that. In terms of, you know, when I was writing the book, yes, it's called Jungle Commandos. Jungle Commandos was actually the nickname of the 81st West African Division. So, you know, there's kind of a play there, because it's not just about the commandos, but as you say, I tried to cover the West Africans and the Indian divisions as well, because 3rd Arakan campaign was 25th, 26th Indian Infantry Division, 81st, 82nd West African Division, and the Commandos. So it was a real kind of, you know, when you look at it, it's a great representation of the Burma campaign as a whole. You know, the biggest struggle I found was finding African voices. You know, that there was quite a bit from officers in the 81st and 82nd West African Division, much more difficult to find the voices of the African men themselves. I've done my best to include what I could find, but obviously without being able to go to the archives in Nigeria and places like that. Unfortunately, my budget didn't stretch to that kind of research. That's been a little bit tricky, but I wanted to present in that some different viewpoints. I think it's very easy to kind of go with the idea that they were kind of all coerced into fighting for the empire. But actually, when you read the chapters about the Africans, I hope that I've kind of provided a bit more nuance on that, and just kind of challenged the idea that there's one monolithic view of just, you know, the Africans fighting in Burma, and actually people joined for all kinds of different reasons.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think when you've got some maps you can show us. The other thing, you know, in looking at the book is, in the Navy, as you said, combined arms, logistics, because you just said it yourself, really. We do have this image of kind of people hacking through the middle of the jungle in the middle of nowhere, and we think of the amphibious aspects of the Far East as being, well, the Pacific being the Americans, the island hopping campaign. And you know, when you were on last time, you know, you made the you know, rivers, estuaries, amphibious landings, combined ops, getting in and out of different types of craft and things like that. And I think that's going to, you know, for those who aren't familiar, that aspect of it will surprise people, because I think they are, as I said, stuck in this idea of people on trails in the middle of jungles and mist and mountains and mangroves. And the campaign takes in lots of types of terrain and lots of types of action. So for those who are unfamiliar with it, give us a little kind of brief sort of rundown of what it is you're covering in the book.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing. You asked me at the beginning. Obviously, I think I came on. I think it was like 2020 when I came on originally.
We were both young, and it was a very, very different era.
It was a long time ago, and I've learned a lot since then. I mean, I knew a fair bit about it from my granddad, but the biggest area actually of research is the naval aspect. And there were some amazing resources on that in the archives. And I think, you know, when we think of Burma, naturally we think of jungle. That's fine, that's fair. There's a lot of that there. But there's also mountains. There's also, you know, open plains. There's paddy fields. There's swampland. And the campaign in Arakan that I've been writing about here it was the first combined operations in the Burma campaign, and it saw the development of something completely unique in the war, and that was the development of chung warfare. Chungs is just basically the word for these kind of tidal small streams and waterways that cut across the Arakan, and that was something completely new. No one had to work out how to land troops off of these, and nobody had to. I mean, actually, a lot of the waters that they were going into, 464, who were the naval kind of aspect of this, led by the long-suffering Captain Duncan Codwise Hill, which is an amazing name. You know, they were asked to develop this at the drop of a hat. You know, some of the operations and some of the landings, they had like 24, 48 hours to plan, and they were going into uncharted waters. So it's quite incredible. And not only were they doing that, but they were doing it with, you know, kind of the odds and sods of landing craft not wanted by Europe, you know, because obviously Burma was pretty starved of resources. So for me, that was the most kind of eye-opening part of the research. So for those who don't know, 3rd Arakan campaign, I think I've got like a little thing just to explain why it was important. So this map here shows Burma. We know that it's very difficult for overland transport in Burma. It's not really a thing. And to supply Slim and his advance to Rangoon, Arakan was needed for the air bases. That's the objective, really. The air bases and ports. The red line is on the map is the limit of air supply without Arakan. The purple line and the blue line, the airfields in Akyab and Ramri, obviously extend that to those lines. So it makes a huge difference to the operations in Burma as a whole. Arakan was somewhere that the Allies were after. Almost plans for the first operations in Arakan began, even as the last troops were staggering out in the horrible retreat in early 1942. The first Arakan campaign was an unmitigated disaster. A talk for another time, but led by Noel Irwin, it was just unprecedented numbers of casualties, on top of the fact that these men that were fighting had their morale crushed to death anyway in the retreat. They were then sent in with tactics that were not suitable, in a command structure that was not fit for purpose, and it resulted in not only a terrible defeat for the British and Indian armies involved, but high numbers of casualties, and really kicked the boot in. By the time of the second campaign in Arakan, things had changed a lot. So we had Slim come in, take a much larger role, development of 14th Army, complete restructuring of Allied command. And, there were successes there. So admin box is obviously the one that people know, most familiar with. So by the time we come to the third Arakan campaign, things are in a much better state. The tide is really turning against the Japanese. Morale is high. The task is given to 15 Corps under General Christensen. He's, an experienced commander. He's an interesting chap. And as I've said in a couple of talks I've done, I'm desperate to learn more about him, because what I've come across, looking at his memoirs, he's incredibly generous to himself. And he has a very different view and a very different perspective of how events unfolded compared to everybody else. It's some of the stuff in there, I'm just like, where did you get this from, Christy? Because this just didn't happen. But whatever. He was a good commander, and he understood the importance of health, in particular with his troops, which is a huge thing in the Burma campaign, keeping on top of keeping malaria at bay. And he understood morale, and he had a personal reason, real personal connection to the Burma campaign, because his son was killed. So right. He was tasked with not just capturing these airfields, but containing the sort of remnants of the Japanese 28th Army in Arakan, to stop them crossing over the Yoma Mountains and kind of hitting Slim in the flank as he marched on to Rangoon. So the division involved, as I've said, the 25th, 26th and 81st, 82nd. And the plan loosely, this is kind of an overview map. And the difficulty with Burma, Woody, is, I think, and this is something my mum said when she went out there with my granddad to visit these places, and said, the difficulty with it is a lot of the place names are incredibly unfamiliar. I don't even know how to pronounce half of them, never mind, I write a lot of them. God knows what the pronunciation is on a lot of them. And I think that turns a lot of people off. And I've tried to, in writing the book, I've included some, but it's difficult with maps, because at least in Europe, where things are broadly, and it's very difficult to get that in kind of understand the operations in context in Burma. I think I've included 4. I was limited to just 4 maps. I wish I could have included like 24 and had them far more detailed.
People
but
like John Parcel, who's going to have 134 maps in his 1942 book. I mean, how the other half live, eh, bastard?
100%. I was like, originally I was only sort of given to have 2 in there, and I was like, God, I can't cope with that. I need at least 4. So I've tried to keep them basic, but the idea was there was a sort of 3-pronged thrust. One was down the coastal side, so you can see sort of from Mongdor to Akyab there, and that was going to be undertaken by the 25th Indian Division. You then had the West Africans, who were going to drive down the Kladden Valley. Their initial sort of plan for those guys was that they were doing nothing but providing flank protection to the main advance. There wasn't kind of this idea of them being this crack offensive unit, which they turned out to be. So that kind of developed significantly. And then you had the 82nd West African Division, who would support the 25th Division initially, and then they would go across Arakan and meet with their 81st comrades at Myo Hung. And it kind of developed from there, really. I think the most interesting thing about the 1945 Arakan campaign is how quickly it developed. The initial plans for it, the objectives were hit like 2-3 weeks in advance, and it was so changeable that the amphibious operations at Kangor with the Commandos weren't even really planned for initially. They came once Akyap had been occupied, which was very quick in 1st of January, 2nd of January, and that was done. When the time they got there, they planned for this huge sort of landing there, and by the time they got there, they found the Japanese had left. So that was a bit of a damp squib, and that changed everything. And that then allowed Christie to push on, and we had the operations at Maibon, and then the further landings at Kangor, and then afterwards it continued with multiple little kind of hops down the coastline, if you will. So it was very, very fast-moving campaign, and again, that's why I think props to all the commanders, many of whom names you'll never have heard of, but amazing commanders who were pulled together to do these things at last minute notice, which is just mad to me, especially given the conditions they were in.
And you just said they're fast moving, and looking at the maps and looking at your book, do you feel that sometimes when people see a campaign moving fast, they therefore think it's moving without problems, it's moving very efficiently? Because you mentioned the Kohima and the box and Imphal, and I think a lot of people think that after that, that's it. Everything's reversed. The Allies are completely on the offensive. Nothing's going to go wrong now. Slim has created an army that has mastered the terrain, mastered the jungle. The old days of 42 are way in the past. But the campaign showed up some efficiencies, but it also seemed to show out some deficiencies as well. And it was a bit sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Is that a rough summary of how it went in some ways?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the Burma campaign as a whole. I think in Arakan, certainly just because it was fast moving, that's not to say that the Japanese were rolling over. They were meeting this threat, and they were meeting this offensive head on, and they were reacting quickly to it. In the Culloden, first of all, they didn't expect the 25th Indian Division to be as successful as they were, and they didn't expect to have to withdraw from Akyab. They did that because of the pressure of the 81st West African Division down the Culloden Valley. So, that caught the Japanese off guard. But they brought in, people like General Koba, who was an incredibly experienced and highly skilled commanding officer, and his Matsu force in the Culloden. I mean, these are very experienced troops, and they knew what they were doing, and they didn't make it easy. This wasn't a walkover, it was just a clear demonstration of the skill and the lessons learned, I think, over the years. I think that's what it really is about. This is about everything coming together, and also it's about, for example, the 25th Indian Division. They were newly raised when the war in Burma began. They were originally tasked with defending India. They weren't ever really due to go to Burma. And there were a lot of doubters still. Even in 44, there were a lot of doubters about the skill of Indian troops, and certainly the West Africans. I mean, even Slim wasn't particularly generous to the West African troops. His main kind of gripe with them was the fact that they didn't use transport. So they didn't have wheeled transport. They didn't even use mules. They used head loadings, a traditional African form of moving supplies around. And they had these auxiliary units that were part of their divisions. And Slim was very derisory about them. He sort of viewed them as, why are you sending troops in who aren't even armed, and they're just taking rations and they're not really contributing a lot? Well, actually, that was the reason they were so successful, is because they could move down these small, narrow tracks, because it was just men. It was just men moving supplies. Didn't even have to have room enough to get mules through. So, they proved a lot of people wrong, and it was the same with the 25th Indian Infantry Division. And in fact, this campaign saw the first time, and I think the first and only time in the Second World War, that an entire brigade was commanded in battle by an Indian soldier, and that just unheard of. So that there was a lot of kind of proving people wrong, and also the culmination of the lessons that had been learned in the previous years in Burma to kind of make this successful. But it was by no means a walkover, and that was shown by the fighting at Kangor, which, you know, is widely sort of agreed upon as being some of the worst and most brutal fighting in the entire campaign, within that sort of small time period. Yeah.
Yeah, great. And just, I love it when there's someone with a personal connection. So Tony's dad flew in support of the Kangor action. So we have that little direct connection. That's what I love about YouTube, where you have that connection with someone watching who's got that, you know, an actual personal relationship with this. And Gary asked about the motivation of the West African troops. You know, like, who are they fighting for? How are they paid? Because one of the themes of some of the discussions we've had this year for the 80th anniversary of 1945 is that people are starting to think about the post-war maps. It's not 42 when it's the only problem facing everybody is defeating the Japanese. People are starting to think about, okay, so what is going to happen later on? Independence is being mentioned by various people of various areas. The West Africans fighting in this campaign, I mean, you said you didn't have that much from the men themselves, but you've got some of the officers. What are they fighting for in 45? It's not their continent. They're fighting for the British Empire, but what are they really fighting for in the Lucy Betteridge-Dyson interpretation?
Well, I guess I'd answer that with a question to you, really. Why do people join the army ever? You know, in the history of wars, why do people join an army? You know, because you get, you know, a lot of people, my husband, for example, you know, you move to get out of the area you're living in, for example. You know, it's a sense of adventure. Your food and board is covered. It's a job, it pays. These motivations weren't any different just because you're talking about African troops, and that's what came across actually in a lot of the stuff that I did find, and I was quite surprised by that. I guess I kind of went into it with all this thoughts of empire, and yes, there was, don't get me wrong, there was essentially conscription to get the numbers up, so I don't want to kind of gloss over that. There was that, and that wasn't you know, that certainly is not something that I'm saying we should be proud of or anything like that, and I'm not giving credence to imperialism, but I'm just saying there are other reasons, and we do have to be careful not to wash everything and just say, you know, everybody was just coerced into joining. No, you know, there was one chap who, you know, he saw a Land Rover parked up and some troops in it doing some radio comms, and he was just chilling on the beach. He was a student at the time, and he was just really curious, and he went over and spoke to the guys in there, and they explained that they were talking to London via radio, and he was so amazed and so taken by how this technology could work. He immediately went and just signed up to the signals because he wanted to learn more and he wanted to do that job. So, you know, there's a lot of stuff that's just the same for men all over. And there were also people who did want to fight for the British. You know, that might not be palatable for people to believe, and we can dig into why that is, and whether, you know, it's a bit like ideas of internalized misogyny. You know, the system has put that in place, and that's not right, but nevertheless that was there for them. So yeah, you know, there's no one reason, is there, ever? We've got to be careful with that. Each man is his own.
Yeah, good point. We've got a couple of questions regarding specifically the West African troops and other units. So Gina is saying, I just had it a second, I've lost it now. May I ask Lucy if the Royal Warwickshires and 2nd Battalion, the Nigeria Regiment, came up in her research at some point?
Yes, yeah, they did. You know, the Nigerian Regiment, pretty incredible. I think, you know, I've tried in the book, so this was kind of again, kind of going back to the idea of including loads of place names and making it a bit dry. I tried to not include too much detail, and also just because it was so much I had to fit in, to not go into too, I mean, there's so much more I could have written about it. It could have been like, you know, 5 books worth. So I've tried not to go into too much detail on individual units, and rather pick a few to illustrate the actions. But yes, they did come up. I really want to do a lot more research, and perhaps there's another book in there just about the West Africans and the Culloden campaigns, because there were 2. This, as part of 1945, was the more successful one. The earlier one in early 1944 was less successful. So that's something that, you know, I keep your eye on, because I think I've got another book in there for sure.
Well, good. And Ian is asking again, for people who are unfamiliar with the subject, the makeup of these units. I'm glad people are asking about the non-white troops. It makes me warms the cockles of my heart. So Ian is saying, from what present day countries are the West African Regiment recruited? I mean, the badge is the spider from Ashanti, isn't it? If I remember correctly, the 81st Division. But
yeah, that exactly. Yeah. So you've got Gambia, Gold Coast, Nigeria, Sierra Leone. I will just caveat all of this with the fact that I've got a 7-week-old baby, so my brain is somewhat like
and
information is
congratulations from all of us,
falling
obviously.
out of it. But it was the West African nation, so yeah, I probably missed a couple off there. But yeah, Gold Coast and Nigeria were big ones.
We've got other questions later on. You mentioned about the naval archives you discovered, which is really exciting. And so Gary asked about, and I'm going to mess up the pronunciation, Cheduba Island, similar to Ceuta to Guadalcanal shipping lane, yeah. Because that's that aspect of, again, of we think of everything starting perhaps within the countryside, but you've got to get people there first. And of course, the Burma campaign or the Myanmar campaign connects to the places left and right. And again, that contextual idea of trying to place that campaign and those operations with regards to shipping. So, what's your response to that?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, Chejuba also had a small airfield on it as well, which was also important. But as I mentioned, there was also this idea of ports. So Ramri had quite a large port, and it allowed supplies to be bought more readily from India, load up at those at Ramri, for example, and then ship straight to Rangoon. So it gave another jumping off point essentially for the naval aspect as well as the air. So I think, you know, by the time they're captured, it's quite late. So it did have an impact. But obviously, we're talking at this point, sort of March 45. So whilst it did, you know, if that had been happening in 43, great. That would, you know, who knows what kind of changes that would have made. But it certainly wasn't just about the airfields. It was about, you know, the naval supply. And I think also just navigating and understanding and charting the chungs around Arakan was a huge thing, because most of them, as I say, were completely uncharted. So they were known to the Japanese in far greater detail. So just having that knowledge and knowing where they were going, you know, and working out their lines of communication was equally as important.
Well, we'll do a few more questions if you don't mind. Let's go a scattergun approach to things. David is saying, which terrain was the most challenging to the various divisions? Because you said there's mangrove swamps, there's the open plains. I think Jack Boucher, like yourself, has done a lot of work reminding us that Burma isn't just one type of terrain. I've just been out for 6 days in Normandy, pointing out it changes as you move across it. But you know, in the assessments and the reports and the memoirs of those who are there, I mean, I would think that the jungle, that thick jungle, would be the thing that would be the most terrifying. But I could easily be wrong.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a tough question, I think, because I think actually probably the most challenging thing was the diversity of the landscape, because
it's constantly changing. Yeah,
exactly. It meant that troops had to be able to cope in, you know, bamboo scrub covered mountains, like, you know, the Modoc Range off the Caledon that had, you know, huge heights there that the West Africans had to scale, and then they're dropping into virgin jungle that they had to hack through. So, you know, you're going from one to another. For the Commandos, obviously, who trained in Aknakari, they, you know, the Highlands of Scotland is somewhat different climate from Burma. So there was a tad different. Yeah, just a bit. So, you know, there was an adaptation there. They had like a couple of weeks, I don't know, like probably a bit more generous than that, a month, 6 weeks or so in India, doing a bit of training. But again, even that is different to the landscape in Arakan. I think from an operational standpoint, the most difficult thing was the waterways and the sort of coastal, the fractured coastline. You can see from this map how fractured it is. And a lot of the land in between that was essentially swampland and open paddy. So moving supplies, and just the logistics of that and dealing with that was probably the most challenging thing, I would say. But it was more about the flexibility, I think, in having to deal with all these sudden changes when you're plotting a route through the country.
Yeah. And another question which just came to me then is we did a series earlier this year on the Western European campaign after sort of September 44, and is it about attriting the enemy? Is it about liberating peoples? Is it about covering geographical distances? And I guess this campaign is sort of a little bit of everything. Mostly the attritional of there's a Japanese army out there that still, despite having had its nose bloodied, needs to be reduced in size to carry on. But there's also a moving across and getting ground under your belt. I mean, how is it seen? How is it planned at like an operational level? Would they rather move slowly but make sure they're knocking out more Japanese units, or is their sense of speed being the important thing?
Yeah, it's a good question, really, and I think you have to bear in mind the Japanese tactics. When kind of thinking about that, they were kind of relied on speed. They were lightly armed, and they relied on these kind of encircling tactics to break the much larger, often British and Indian forces that were attacking. In 1943, in the first Arakan campaign, the British were using, I can only describe as sort of First World War Western Front style tactics, and that's why they were completely taken aback by the Japanese, who were traveled light and quick, and I think so trying to sort of clear the full area of the Japanese is very difficult because they're constantly moving. This is not static war, really. This is a war of movement, and particularly in the Claddon, we seem to be chatting quite a lot about the West Africans, which I'm more than happy to do. But it's important because, those guys were essentially long-range penetration to a degree. They were, really, arguably, they were doing what the Chindits did, but a little bit more successfully in how they moved. They were just going for speed. And they were kind of in a race with the Japanese. They were constantly avoiding each other. There's not like the Japanese are here and the West Africans are here. It's like this. It's constant back and forth. But all the while, the Japanese don't want to get cut off. So they're kind of using a bit of the Japanese tactics against them. It's a bit of a taste of their own medicine there. And that's why the Japanese are forced back to Kangor, essentially, because the West Africans are penetrating so quickly down to Myo Hong that Koba is forced to bring his troops back. So it's a bit of everything, as you said.
And I think we may have mentioned this last time, although it was a long time ago. But when we think of commandos, we probably think of Walcheren in the Netherlands, we think of D-Day, and we think of some of the operations elsewhere. But as Jack Bauscher made with his Thunder Run, that it was one of the best examples of tank infantry cooperation in Burma. In what you've written, it seems that this is sort of where the Allies get the whole concept of commandos really sorted out. You mentioned there the Chindits, which we're not going to go down the rabbit hole of talking about them, but the concept was definitely there. The concept was there, and yet it has to go through a process of evolution to be something else. And I think what the Commando Brigade were doing here is taking a bit of what the Chindits had done. It's taking a bit of the Arachnikari kind of commando concept from the ETO, adding a bit of experience of what the Navy have been doing in this part of the world, adding a bit of some terrain expertise and some of Slim's influence passing on down, and in a weird way, the perfect product.
Yeah, I would say so. I am biased, but I would say so. I think a lot of people. So when I talk about this, obviously people have certain ideas of the commandos in the Second World War. It's either spearheading large amphibious landings, obviously Normandy, etc., or it's kind of going back to their roots and more independent company style raiding, like Norway and things like that. A lot of people don't even realize that commandos fought in Burma, and what they did there was a combination of both. You're right. It's they were leading the 25th Indian Infantry Division mostly into attack, but they were also, they did a little bit of kind of the more kind of irregular warfare stuff. Actually, in the second Arakan campaign, 5 Commando and 4 Commando did Operation Screwdriver 1 and 2. So that was kind of the first taste that they had, which were kind of more like raiding operations. But by 1945, they were doing a bit of everything. They were working with the tanks of the 19th Lancers. They were really spearheading these big attacks. But you're right. I think it was kind of a combination of everything. And that's true as well of the campaign as a whole in terms of the cooperation, between, armor, air, and naval and infantry. It really was everything together. And you took one of those elements out and it wouldn't have worked as it did. Tanks were important. I know Jack covered my Bon a bit in his first book. So, all of this came together just the right time. I can see that Darren's mentioned COP, and I know Rob's watching as well, and they were super important. So the combined operations pillage parties, because they went in and did the little bit of reconnaissance that they had time to do in these areas, and without, I mean, certainly at my Bon, without the work that they did in discovering the Japanese defences off the coast. I mean, and they were incredible as well. I've got to thank Rob for sharing some of his amazing research with me for the book.
He's sending a little hearty face there, and and SOE, and I think that the fact that we have to list all the various people that were involved in this is a demonstration of the fact of how well it's all working. Is because there was, when you look back at the early years of this campaign, there's a lot of sort of suck it and see and find out when you get there, and we don't really have a doctrine for this, and and it's lots of reaction to what the Japanese are doing. There is much more by this time a sense of, no, this is the Japanese will have to react to what the measures and methods we are using, the Allies are using. And I think that some ways, because a campaign is successful, we Brits particularly have less interest in it, because we sort of like our Dunkirks. And
that's a weird thing, isn't it?
It's when things go well. I mean, look at Market Garden. We keep talking about Market Garden because it wasn't perfect. And when and I'm not saying that Arakan was perfect, but we sort of like one that has a struggle in the middle act, because it kind of gives us that resolution.
I think I think you've kind of hit the nail on the head, actually, what you said. By this point, 15 Corps, there was a confidence about these operations. There was a confidence that they're going to bring the fight to the Japanese, and that's so different to what had happened in Burma before. And maybe that's why it's not covered as much, because we like a bit of it, but that there's a greater focus on all the awful things that the Japanese did, and all the kind of struggles that were endured. There's an endurance about the Burma campaign that people like to focus on, rather than there's a victory there. We were successful in Burma. I know people don't like to think that, but there was. And so there's I think you're right. There's that weird British thing of just all the focus on the tragedies, which is right. We got to. But actually, it's where everything's coming together.
I think you hit it on the nail on the head there. We have this, not obsession, but the fact that these guys on some of the early missions have dropped down how many pounds in weight, and they're drenched in sweat, and it's the resolve and determination that we sort of admire. And yet actually an efficient system is something that's better to admire in a certain way from an objective point of view.
And don't get me wrong, like within this campaign, there are those moments, the landings at my Bon where, the tide went out and 4 landed in, about 400 yards out, and sort of waist shoulder deep in this quicksand mud, and took them a whole day to get to the shoreline, and then of course Hill 170, Pinner, the fighting at Kangor, that of course there are the struggles within it, and we focus on how amazing it was that the Commandos succeeded, and their dedication, their discipline, and their, as you said, their endurance. But overall, this was a very successful campaign, and I think that's why I want to dig into it. It's so much to celebrate, and it was so difficult writing the book in working out what to include and what not to include, because as I said, even just talking about this, I could talk about it for 4 or 5 hours, all the amazing the successes of the individual units, of the individual men, so it was tricky. And I tried to give in the book a kind of a slice of what the 25th Indian Division did, a slice of what the West Africans did, and then of course what the Commandos did, and then trying to bring that together, and kind of, I guess, towards the end of the book, why is it important, and answering what the aftermath was of this, as well, because it's all very well talking about the actual event and how successful it was, but why did it matter?
Well, why did it matter?
It's a great question. Well,
you set me up there.
Obviously we've spoken about the airfields, and by the time that sort of 15 Corps end of operations at Kangor, let's say mid-February, so the last hill, I'll just bring up this map. So for those who don't know, the Kangor operations, the idea was to put a blockade in place at a village known as Kangor, and that was to not only kind of contain the Japanese forces, but it was also to stop their supply and also gain access to one of the few paths into central Burma over the Yoma Mountains. And as part of it, they had to capture these different hills that are noted on this map. The last one was captured and cleared in 18th of February 1945, and that opened the door then for this kind of hopping further down Arakan, so to Tongup down at the bottom there. And it was amazing because after Kangor, Christie had his resources slashed even further because Slim was making such good progress in central Burma. He needed more aircraft to supply him, so his like air supply, Christie's air supply dropped like 90% or something ridiculous. But the success of all of that gave Slim what he needed. It gave him the ability. They built the airfields up very quickly at Akyab and Ramri, and it allowed Slim to push quickly to Rangoon. And actually, it was the 26th Indian Infantry Division, so it was, a division of 15 Corps that was part of Operation Dracula that landed at Rangoon. So, their involvement.
My favorite operation in World War II by the name alone. I love just
Dracula.
Operation Dracula.
Cool.
I don't care what they did. It's just a brilliant name.
Yeah. I mean, the Japanese had left mostly again already by that point. So it was again a bit of a damp squib in that regard. But without what happened in Arakan, when I think Slim would have got to Rangoon for sure, but would it have been so quickly? No. And so you could say in that sense that perhaps it hastens the end of things entirely in Burma.
Yeah, which and everything is coming to an end, I guess, in 45. But a few questions earlier on about malaria, dysentery, and again, when we had Tony Redding on a few years ago talking about chindits and having to cut the arse out of their trousers so they can walk along on march. I mean, you mentioned confidence earlier on. Medical situation has got better. Evacuation, things like that, resupply, anything that you think is like a particular masterstroke with regards to sort of prevention of disease or treatment of disease that sort of the distinct makes the 45 campaign distinct from the earlier ones?
No, I think it's just discipline. When Slim and Mountbatten, when we had that big change in structure in the Allies' operations in Burma in sort of late 43, 44, their big focus was health, because we know so many of the casualties that occurred in those early years in Burma were due to illness and sickness rather than enemy engagement. So, taking your anti-malarials, seeing the medics just when you needed to rather than leaving it.
Yeah.
But the men still had to deal with an awful lot of horrible things. I mean, my granddad still got malaria. He still got dengue fever. Pretty much most men did. It's just about how they were treated. And the fact that, the level of prevention was much higher. But it was the day-to-day things, I think, Dobie's itch and things like that, these horrible things caused by living in damp, hot conditions that just can't be avoided, that cause a lot of problems, leeches, all that kind of stuff that men still had to deal with. I think it was just a case of the bigger diseases and the kind of amount of men being invalided out was far fewer, because treatment had got better and they were more, the idea of taking your anti-malarials was brought up the agenda. You'd get, reprimanded if you hadn't, or if you hadn't taken your salt tablets or whatever. That was seen as a much more serious thing than perhaps earlier in the war.
No, definitely. Yeah. And we had another question, changing the subject completely. Did the Allied forces here know about how badly the Japanese had been with prisoners at this stage? Did it affect their will to take prisoners or be taken prisoner? I mean, we had this in the ETO earlier, where the push towards liberation of the death camps is that, are the Allies aware of it? Does it affect things? We now are fully aware of the horrors of Changi and the Death Railway, which wouldn't have been aware to people fighting in 42. But by 45, if you're in the Commando Brigade moving into the Arakan, were you aware of this kind of stuff?
I don't know if they were necessarily aware of the camps in that sense and the treatment of prisoners at that point. What they were aware of, certainly, and it was something that comes up again and again and again, and this is the word that the veterans often use, it's a word my granddad used, was cruelty. The Japanese were cruel. And, they saw there's a there was a sort of anecdote that I think I've included in the book about when the Commandos were in, I think it's actually an Operation Screwdriver, so it's sort of mid 1944. They got attacked by the Japanese, and the Japanese captured one of the Commandos, and essentially tortured him and left him in a paddy field tied to a tree or something like this. And the idea was that he was going to be used as bait to entice his comrades to come and collect him, and then the Japanese would attack them. In the end, he actually survived. He was cared for by villagers, and I think that's another big point that we haven't mentioned at all. We'll just get it in there, was the local population in Arakan who had seen, in the Culminating, for example, they'd been under British occupation, they'd been under Japanese occupation, and they'd seen the cruelty of the Japanese as well, because they were not nice to the native population in Burma who had assisted the Allies previously. They took revenge on them. So when the Allies came through again, when the West African divisions came through the Culminating again, and the villagers saw them, they were all the more willing to help them. It had the opposite effect that the Japanese were thinking it was going to have. So I think, yes, they were aware of the cruelty, and this idea that, this very different ideology that underlies the Japanese military. They knew about that, but it was more through their experience and just day-to-day fighting them. I'm not sure they were aware of the bigger picture. I'm not sure that matters, because I think the actual outcome is the same. You don't want to be caught. No, you don't want to be captured. And when you do, capture the Japanese prisoners, certainly the Gurkhas, in one incident where the Gurkhas went after the Japanese who had captured some of their own men. And one of the veterans, whether this is true or not, obviously I've not come across anything official on this, but there was, one chap said that the Gurkhas actually skinned one of the Japanese prisoners alive, because they were so, distraught by what the Japanese had done previously. So, yeah, it changed the attitudes, definitely.
Rob Crane added a appropriate but slightly queasy a comment there from an RAF guy: diseases of the ass. Most of the diseases and illnesses which you can suffer in the jungle are avoidable. It is no compliment to your intelligence if you contract them. Thanks for that, Rob.
I presume we're not talking about mules there.
Yeah, I assume we're talking about yes. I mean, well, let's not dwell on that. But it's the fact that that's from an RAF guide is interesting. Gary August asked about but I'll broaden the question out. What effect would a Japanese success in retaking Hill 170 have had? I mean, is there anything that the Japanese can do in this campaign that actually potentially derails the British and Commonwealth plans there, or is it all just rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic?
I mean, I think if the Kangor operations hadn't been successful, it would have delayed the Allies. I don't know whether it would have had a major change in the end outcome, because I think by that point, the 55th Japanese Division, so the remnants of the 28th Army that are left in Arakan by that point are already, I think for me, their future is already written. They are outnumbered, they are outgunned, and they are tired. They are far more tired than the Allies, who are kind of, running on this high morale. They've got this confidence. So, I think personally they would have found another route, another way to cut off the Japanese, or even just to go round and avoid Kangor completely. So I don't know. Counterfactuals. I'm always tricky at answering those.
Yeah, they're always. I mean, there's another discussion aside about the Commandos using M1 Garands and American issue rifles. Obviously, you're no stranger to firing weapons on TV and Army husband, that kind of thing. Do you think that was something that was worth of mentioning the Commandos? I mean, why did they use certain weapons? Is it something that you felt was a feature or worth commenting on?
I know my limits, Woody, and I know what I know and don't know, and I know absolutely nothing about guns. They're things that you shoot, and I can tell you about light machine guns, and the difference between that and rifles. Getting into the nitty gritty of it is not my bag, I'm afraid. So I'm not even going to try.
I mean, they're discussing amongst themselves whether what the reasons may be for having them. But it's, as you say, a rifle is a rifle, I guess, in the jungle. But
bullet comes out. If it's effective, great. If it's not, then okay. That's about as far as my kind of knowledge of them goes. I did notice that somebody spoke about crocodiles, and I pulled James up on this when I was on the We Have Ways thing a few weeks ago, because I think they perpetuated the myth that crocodiles ate a lot of soldiers at Ramri Island, and it's just not true. So I just want to say that on the record, crocodiles did not eat Japanese soldiers at Ramri Island. So I'm just getting that out there.
Good. That's
it's a great story, but it's not.
It's a great story, and a lot of the best stories are hard to prove, which is one of the interesting things about history. So going kind of more broadly back again to what your aims are of the book, because you make it very clear at the beginning it's a personal connection. Your grandfather was there. Your members of your family went back with your grandfather there. Clearly very important to him, both the Forgotten Army moniker, but also his personal involvement in that. So you wanted to get across the fact that it's not quite as forgotten as it used to be, and that was a term that was applicable to them, that not necessarily in terms of history. You want to get the story out there, but do you I don't want to do a trite interview. Did you think you make your granddad proud with this? But I mean, because I haven't asked that question. But
no, you haven't.
Because that would be awful. I'd sack myself for that. But yeah, it is about time some of these people did get some more recognition, because Slim does loom large in Burma, and it's often put down to Slim was great and everything else just followed into soup. But actually, there's a lot of people at the bottom end, the sergeants and corporals, and you've given them a voice again.
Yeah, and that was really important to me, because it was something that my granddad, like many veterans, and most, I think, of the Burma campaign, did not talk about it. He did not really speak about it. The only time I ever heard him talk about it was, I think it was like 2004, I want to say, maybe 2005 it came out. There was a documentary on the BBC, which I mentioned in the intro to the book, called Memories of a Forgotten War, I think it is. It used to be on YouTube, not that I'm suggesting you watch it there. But it's never been repeated for some reason, but that was the only time I heard him talk about it, because he was interviewed on that program, and that program included a lot of footage from the trip that the guys did back to Burma in 2005. This photo is my granddad is second in from the left, and this photo was taken on Akyab Island. There were 17 veterans. My granddad Ted helped arrange that trip. It was sort of led by Remembrance Travel, who were like part of the Royal British Legion at the time. And it was the first and only time a group, even to date now, a group of veterans had been back to Kangor. One veteran had been back there previously on his own, or with his daughter, I think, or son. But other than that, it's so difficult to get there, and it's now impossible to get there because of the civil war in Burma. They had special permission from the junta to visit, and the logistics involved in this battlefield trip were incredible. And Woody, from taking people around the battlefields, how cathartic it is. I mean, can you imagine going back somewhere like that and having the opportunity to do it? And these guys were in their 80s then, and they're dealing with like 40-degree heat. They're dealing with this terrain that they struggled to deal with as young, fit commandos, and still they persevered. And my granddad couldn't quite make it to the top of Pinner or 170, but some of them did, and that's amazing. So yeah, it's about telling that story. It's about giving a voice to the voices that have been hidden in the archives. And yes, they've probably been read and known by people like me who have been interested in it anyway, but never really spoken about in a book to this degree, and brought to the public's knowledge. It's weird, like the campaign in Arakan, as important as it was, it's always just mentioned as like a sideline in big books about Burma. It comes up in John Latimer, it comes up in lots of books, but it's like given 2 or 3 pages at best. So
it often feels like it's because you got Imphal and Kohima before it feels like this is like the 3rd, 4th playoff final, as opposed it's like the actual defeat has occurred now in Burma. This is, we've been talking a lot recently on the channel about the how much I hate the expression mopping up, because you get that kind of the main thing happens and now they're just mopping up as if no one gets killed in mopping up operations. I'm not saying that Arakan is like a mopping up, but it's like it does seem to be on like a downward hill after 100%. Imphal and Kohima, and I don't like that. The other thing is that you're emphasizing there, for your grandfather, it was the other side of the world. It was completely alien. But you said about 10 minutes ago about the local people there, and the fact for them it was a liberation, because when I was a young kid, I didn't think of that campaign as having liberation. I felt it was everybody was there in an arena. The Japanese weren't from there. The British and West Africans weren't from there. But of course, there are people for whom it was their home, and they don't or haven't had as much a voice. And as you say there, with Myanmar not being a place that we can easily visit today, it's or visit at all, really, it's important that the fact that for those people, they had experienced some of the worst of the Japanese occupation, and for them it was liberation. And I think we don't think about liberation in Burma. We think about it, as I say, as being an arena of combat from people from outside.
Yeah, man. And I think, I touch on it sort of to try and give a little introduction to the Burma campaign. If you're unfamiliar, I've tried to make the book as accessible as possible, basically, to people who know nothing about the Burma campaign. So the first couple of chapters, I've kind of given like a little rundown of things, because the social and cultural backdrop to the war in Burma is so complicated. And I think that's another reason why people are maybe put off in digging into it a bit more as a theatre. Rob's book War of Empires goes into that in amazing detail. But it's a big book. It's you've got to dedicate yourself. It's well written and it's incredibly engaging, but it's so complicated, Burma, that understanding.
It was one of the books when I read it, I had to be in my A game. I couldn't read that one if I was sleepy. You've got it's
a bit like Lord of the Rings. You've got to keep referring back to. You need some kind of like appendix of everything and the names of everybody and all the different factions of the hill tribes and this and that. So it is very complicated. But you're right. It's about giving a voice to those guys as well. And I know when they went back to Burma, my granddad went and visited like this, I can't remember who off the top of my head, but one of the native chaps who had helped them in one of the operations. A couple of the commandos went to visit him and see him again after all those years, which it's just amazing. So I would, in terms of would he be proud of me for writing the book, I think he'd just be bloody glad that it's been written. I don't think he would have cared who wrote it, to be honest with you. He spent a lot of his time in the Commando Association and in the years after trying to give a name to not just 170, Hill 170, massively important, but to the fighting on Pinner, the other hills, to everything else that went on, my bond. So I'm just glad it's out there, and I've tried to write it in a style that is treading that ever so fine line between sort of scholarly research and an entertaining read.
I can only imagine what it would have been like at Commando associations with Normandy getting some more of the focus, and Volker and maybe Dieppe getting a bit in there as well, and the Burma lads kind of being excuse, and I'd imagine also that less Burma veterans would even wanted to go to those things because of just not many nice memories. You'd remember your mates. But if you're fighting in Europe, at least you have got some proper liberations. You've got some handing back places and some maybe meeting some local girls and that kind of thing. That the Burma campaign doesn't really have that aspect.
I don't know. They were a tight knit group, Woody. Like any chance to meet up.
Green Beret, I suppose.
The last sort of 4-4 commando meet. I mean, the only reason they stopped doing it was just because my granddad just said there were like so few left that it was just bloody depressing. Because every year you'd go and it'd be like, well, who's died recently? And he was just like, once it got to that point, call it a day kind of thing with the meets. But I remember going to one of them at the Union Jack Club with him, and it's just incredible mix of what the commandos did represented at the Commando Association meets, definitely.
Yeah, I went to a few parachute regiment meetings, but never went to a commando one. Ian Carr said, has Lucy actually given us her grandfather's name and rank tonight? I don't think you have you mentioned so name and rank?
It's Captain Edwin Allen Robert Sims, or Ted Sims as he was known. So there we are.
Brilliant. And you mentioned Objective Burma in the beginning of the book, which I was kind of surprised you did, really, because it sort of divides people a bit. I mean, actually, I watched it not that long ago, and it wasn't as bad as I thought it was. It was, but it wasn't great. But again, so any movies about the Burma campaign that are worth watching? Long and Short Tall, Merrill's Marauders, Purple Plain. But do you think the movies affect our portrayal of it? I think comics, for me and for my generation, it seems a lot of the comics were set in Burma. But any movies or things that you think of?
Well, there's two parts to that question. Are there any movies? Yes, there are some. Are they worth watching? Probably not.
Yeah.
I mentioned
not a great selection. Yeah.
Yeah, I mentioned Objective Burma, but I mention it in a kind of using it as an example of you know, how we get Burma wrong to a degree, you know. So I think it's difficult because I guess it's more difficult to film and to make films about Burma purely because of where it is and the kind of environment. Although, you know, I think they could have a good crack at it now. I'm forever trying to get TV channels to commission a documentary or something on Burma. They're just not interested. And I think it could be done even with the difficulty of the logistics, but you know, unless it's got like someone from Towie or some other cruddy D-list celebrity, and then
I mean, you think there'd be somewhere in Australia that would kind of match up somehow, because they film lots of Pacific stuff there, don't they? I mean, you'd think with there'd be somewhere that isn't dangerous to go to, where they could at least match up mangroves
or Borneo or something.
Or, yeah,
do you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, we've gone into movies now, but it's where was Tenko? Someone has set now, you know. But going
ain't
back,
our hot mum. That's it.
Ain't our hot mum. Yeah, let's not go down that one. Going back to this idea of the Burma campaign. Now I'm thinking about that now. Gonna keep me awake now. The Burma campaign. You know, you pay credit in acknowledgements to Jack Bowser and Rob Lyman and other people, and there have been podcasts, things like that. So
yeah.
I feel it can kind of relax the Forgotten War title a little bit and get into grips with it. And I think people have more of an understanding now of the changing terrain. I think we are getting away from it, as we said earlier, just being jungled, you know, Jack's work, your work, things like that. So I think it's about time that people have dived in there. And I mean, people are mentioning in the sidebar, you know, you can Google translate deep, all that kind of stuff, so that, you know, if research work comes up from people who are non-English, you know, if West African accounts turn up or something, the ability to use them would be easier moving forwards. I mean, Jack, when he comes on, he uses Google Earth a lot to describe the actions, because, of course, getting there is harder. Yeah. So I think there were tools in place for the Burma campaign to be discovered, and maybe an oversaturation of Normandy and Arnhem. It's about time that the shift occurred.
100%. I mean, I've included quite a lot of Japanese testimony in the book, and I use kind of a combination of translation tools and checking with people I know, fortunately, who speak Japanese to help me with the translations of things. And maybe it is, again, it's a bit tricky because of just the way the Japanese language is, you know, direct translation isn't really a thing. You have to kind of reword things to get the gist of what people are saying, which is takes a bit more legwork to do. But yeah, it's all out there. And Google Earth is amazing. Like, you know, you can look up, if I would actually encourage anybody who reads the book to go on to Google Earth, look up my Bon. Some of the place names have changed, but my Bon is still there, and that you can use that as your base to explore the area, to really understand, you know, what's going on in Burma, and to look at the terrain, look up the Caledon River. You know, just spend some time on Google Earth, because it's amazing, and I promise you, it will completely just change your view on the Burma campaign. Even if you know and understand stuff now, still when you look on Google Earth, you'll be like, bloody hell. How?
It doesn't have to be
anybody
completely the alien environment it would have been years ago. It can be, we can access it online and send satellite imagery, etc., and make sense of it. And I think I also, as you said earlier, put it back into the context of what is happening in that theatre more widely, and the Rangoon and Slim and I say the naval aspect particularly, I think, is something that's cool to get across. And as we established earlier, how well the Commando Brigade performed, you know, and everything coming together, which I think, despite the fact there are obviously tricky bits and Hill 170 being one of them, but you know, but the methodology is sort of in place.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, you know, it's been a learning curve for me writing this book. This is my first book. I've done sort of academic work before, but this is the first time I've kind of got to grips with something so big, you know. And I think that was the most challenging thing for me was there are so many resources out there, and actually there's so much in the archives.
Yeah.
You're working out how to structure this, how to tell this story, was the more difficult thing. So it's out there for sure.
Yeah.
I noticed that somebody, you know, said, you know, is there more sort of going on with Burma now because it's, you know, becoming fashionable because of the saturation of other subjects? And I think, I mean, I don't think that's true. If it is true, though, who cares? Like, I'm here for it, you know, like if it's fashionable to look at things that aren't being looked at previously, great. I mean, that's what history is all about for me. And there are so many amazing researchers out there with all kinds of different stuff. And actually, you know, that's the difficult thing, I think, is translating that stuff to the public and grasping people's imaginations and making it engaging and getting people to want to turn away from the normal stuff and the usual suspects. And that isn't always easy because, you know, promoters aren't always willing to put you on if you're talking about something that they don't understand or know about. TV channels certainly aren't up for commissioning that stuff. It's difficult. I mean, it's impossible to get things commissioned now anyway. But, you know, it's a bit like the First World War. If it ain't the Somme and Passchendaele for the British, who cares? It's the same battle that you're fighting, I think.
But I think you know, people have said that with things like We Have Ways and the podcast things, is that it's not like people are walking out of the presentations about the Eastern Front or the Sino-Japanese War, Burma, and all flooding off to the dam busters and the market garden. The presentation, they all seem to be getting equal views. This is certainly having good views for a channel on Burma. So
Happy
anyway.
days.
With a 7-week-old, it's time to let you go back to your duties. It's been great speaking to you, and I'll hold up the copy of the book again. And folks, the links to purchasing it are in the description below, or you can get it wherever you get your books. We look forward to the next one, or the next meeting, or the next next conference we're at together, or whatever it will be.
Yeah.
But at the moment, just thank you, Lucy, for sharing your time with us.
Thanks, dear. It's been amazing to be back on World War II TV, and keep doing what you're doing, Woody. It's
Brilliant.
It's fantastic.
Cheers. And you yourself. So I'll be back with Roger Morehouse tomorrow, folks. As always, click like and subscribe, buy my guest books, and consider becoming a patron or channel member. Cheers, everybody. See you tomorrow. Bye.